Right. And today, we'll see how things go. I predict it'll be a little bit shorter than our typical ones, and I'll be open for questions. I'll say that this particular, what's it called, like lesson is best if doing it. So we're actually going to talk about APIs. So that stands for Application Programming Interfaces. We're mostly going to talk about it in the context of like a web API, where you're connecting basically to another website essentially, and you communicating with them. But APIs can also be used in a few other ways too. So just quick poll, just give me like a thumbs up, or if you have your camera off right now, you can just give me in the chat. Who has touched section 12? Is that right? Section 12. So just give me a thumbs up if you at least touched it. You don't have to completely finish it or anything like that. So Brian, yes, no? No? Okay, that's right. And Rebecca and Eduardo, you guys can just send in the chat too, or just verbally say if you've been able to touch it. But I think it helps a lot just doing the API, like actually performing it. So we'll just go ahead and start with me sharing my screen. And I realized one thing I had is I never fixed an issue that was on the repo for this page. So this should be in the data engineering APIs, but I realized I never updated it. So some of this information might not be like currently right now the same as that you see here. I'll try to update that today, so that way it's matched up. But just know if you go up to it, you're like, wait, it looks kind of old. You might need to refresh it, or if you forked it already and you're going off of that, make sure you do a git post and you can get all the information you need. Okay, so APIs. So APIs is basically the reason why we talked about JSON and XML yesterday. So the reason why I talked about JSON, basically almost every API, like, I mean, there's some APIs that still use XML. I have used APIs that use XML, but they're less web interface. But usually you'll see JSON. And usually those are mostly web interfaces as well. But note that there can be other formats. And you can think of APIs, again, like I said, application programming interfaces. You don't have to memorize this. This is not something you ever need to care about. If you say APIs, people will know what you're talking about. But you can think of an API as much more like communication. So it's a way to basically communicate what we'll talk about, a client and a server model. And so this is a way for us to basically send information back and forth. And this, for the most part, is done, like when we talk about APIs, we're usually talking about the web, but it doesn't have to be actually on the web itself. So there's a few parts of an API, what we talk about. It's, like I said, it's not necessarily just web to web. It could also be on your computer. So you can think of it an application to another application. So that's why we say application programming interface. The application part is basically what's sending and receiving these APIs. So the first thing you do is you basically send a request with some info and data. And then what you'll do is your end, you'll get a response, hopefully with some data, basically some information, and possibly like what kind of service it is, like whether it's like, oh, this page was not found, or hey, you know, this page, you know, whatever reason, you get an error code or whatever. So the way I kind of picture this, before I go into some examples, is I kind of imagine it like, it's almost as if like I'm here at my like house, or, you know, whatever, right? Let's say I'm at my house and I have my little messenger boy or whatever, and say, hey, quick, you know, let me write down this, you know, note. Go bring this downtown to blah, 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 and tell me how many pizzas they sold today, right? And so the little delivery boy goes, gets in their car, and like runs over, or I guess bike. This seems like the right thing for a delivery boy. So they get on their bike and they go downtown, talk to their business and say, hey, here's a paper, like, you know, like, what is it? And they're like, oh, I know what this is. And they write down some extra information on that piece of paper. They give it back to the delivery boy. Delivery boy goes in their little bicycle, comes back to me, and then they give me a piece of paper and say, ah, they had 5 pizzas today. So like, that's essentially what an API is, more or less, right? So the idea here is basically you send a request with some information. It can be a very short amount of information. So for example, it could just be requesting, hey, like, what time is it? And the API might give back the time. Or the API says, I don't do that. Like, I know what you're talking about. The API can also be on that send request. We'll call it like a request. It can also give extra information. It's like, hey, like, you know, my name is Victor. Here is like my information. Here's my password, or, you know, something like a password, like authentication key. Also, you know, here's some extra information. Can you give me some more information? And so that would be you sending over some data, and then they respond back with some extra data. So some examples of this, classic ones, is financial transactions. So you can imagine like when you, this is what you sometimes see, like if you ever like do like a little, what's it called? like if you ever try to buy something online and there's kind of like that little loading part, usually what's happening in the back end is there's some kind of API, usually a little more secure than the way I described it. But basically there's some API that's going out to some server to check, hey, is this valid or not? And say, yeah, it's valid, and it comes back, and basically that it gives information. Posting to Twitter, you can actually create like different social medias. I think Facebook doesn't have this, but I know Twitter does for sure. Is there are APIs that can say, okay, like I am this person, go ahead and post this on behalf of me. So you can basically have something like an automated system that would say every time the clock strikes 12 o'clock, says happy midnight or something on a tweet. It can also go the other direction and say, hey, get me all the information about, under this hashtag, or what are the past, 10, 100 tweets or whatever with this specific, information. And then it can return back to you. And usually that will be returned in an XML format, or not XML, sorry, JSON format. Also controlling IoT stuff. So IoT standing for Internet of Things. So this is becoming a little more popular, but especially in industry itself is basically having like little, quote unquote, like really like little small dumb computers or computer light kind of stuff that gives information. And a lot of times you can use APIs to communicate back and forth on those parts. So it makes it really convenient in that way. Okay, but you can always think of it as like a software to software interaction. So that's really what we're doing. We're basically passing information back and forth. Okay, so this leads us into parts of an API. Well, I guess before I lead into this parts of an API, any questions on this kind of process? Okay, yeah, it's relatively simple in the sense of like you're essentially sending a request. You have that thing, what we'll call the client, or sorry, the server. The server does something and then gives it back to you through the client, and the client says, oh, okay, cool, some new information. Okay, so parts of an API. So these are parts that like you'll hear this terminology. So I kind of put them in bold as best I can. So access permissions. So access permissions are a really important aspect of an API because you want to say, is this user even allowed to ask this information? Is this something that is allowed by the user? So like, for example, if you say, hey, post this on behalf of Jenny, but you're not Jenny, well, okay, then that shouldn't go through. So having that permission. But it can also be as simple as like, hey, does this person have access to look at this information? So let's say you have an API that looks at just your specific profile. Well, you want to make sure only you can look at that profile versus someone else. When this goes wrong, it can go very, very wrong. So this happens at times with certain websites and stuff. So it's always important with this user access permissions, and that's pretty typical for an API. Okay, an API call / request. So a call, like I said, you can send a request. You can also call an API call. Essentially, it's what you, as what we'll call like the client, the person who's implementing the first API, you are sending a request. You're calling out a request API call to say, all right, here's what I want. Basically, I wouldn't even call it code. I think and this might actually be from the curriculum, but you can basically use something that's like, let's see here, like code to make a call or API request to implement something. So you can say, hey, here, go do this thing for me to the server. Or it could be, hey, give me some information, okay? What's nice is that you can also ask for like what kind of methods you can have. Say, what can we ask? So you can ask the API sometimes, say, hey, what things am I allowed to do? Think of it kind of like if you ever type in the terminal and you press tab too many times, or if you do like ls and then you do tab, it might say, do you want to see all the different options? That's kind of equivalent to it. Of course, you have to send that request out and then they give that information back. Also parameters. So parameters is more like extra information on top of the method. So like if you have a method in the API that can say post a tweet, on Twitter, they post a tweet. Well, one of the parameters might be, what does the tweet actually say, right? So that would be one of the parameters in there. But it can also be something like, give me all the tweets that have this hashtag or this, phrase or whatever. And one of the parameters would be like, what date frame do you want? Or, how many do you want? Or, what should I be looking for? What hashtag or whatever you're looking for. So those are different parameters as well. Okay. And then the second part of it is the response. So this comes from the actual server going out to you, and basically it's the result of what you asked for. And sometimes that result can just be like a response that says, oh, that was an error. That could also be a valid response. The response could also be success in the sense that like, oh, make this post, this tweet, like post on Twitter this information, and it might respond to say, all right, it was done or something like that. That's kind of like what you expect from API. So you can imagine this is going to take some time going back and forth. Now, when I say take some time, it's relatively quick in kind of our thing, but you can imagine that if you're trying to do things very, very quickly, this can take some time and stuff like that. So there's ways to kind of go around this, but something to keep in mind that it does in fact take some time. It's not instant. Okay. Any questions on these parts then? Sound pretty good? Cool. All right. Yeah, I'm just kind of going through these relatively quickly. So different web type or API types. So I mentioned that it doesn't usually we'll talk about web, but there's also things like databases, operating systems, and hardware. So the first thing, the web, which is what we're mostly going to focus on as a data scientist, is basically things like you'll see REST APIs and stuff like this. Basically, it's a way to interface between the two parts. Remember, you being the client, and then the server is who you're basically making a request to. So examples of this is the Twitter API and the Amazon S3 API. So Amazon S3, if you guys don't know, is anyone familiar with S3? What that means? Okay, S3 is basically like, you can think of like a data bucket. Basically, you can put a bunch of stuff in there. So it's really popular for a lot of data stuff. So you'll see this a lot of times like, oh, it's in an S3 bucket and you can pull this information. So for example, you might have a Kaggle competition where a Kaggle competition might have 800 gigabytes of like photos of like things you can do information on. It's like, well, that's kept in somewhere and that somewhere might be an S3. Well, you can use an API to say, hey, give me not all the pictures, but maybe give me only these pictures or certain amount of pictures, or do give me everything. This is what that API is. Twitter, like I said before, and I'm just going to show you quickly what a documentation looks like. You can see here, basically telling you how to use the API and stuff like this. And hopefully this is all based on documentation. So you can imagine if it's not documented well, you're out of luck, right? So hopefully it's best you can. Finding the documentation for the API will be useful. And usually they'll do something like developer dot or something like that. Usually that's kind of what you'll find the API information in. Okay. So web, that's what you'll mostly use. And again, you have your client, which is me. The web in this case would be like Twitter or Amazon's, server. Okay. Next kind of similar thing, which is also important, is databases, which is kind of similar to our web interfaces. But this usually is a very specific format. It'll pass the data back in a very specific way. Usually it's, like I said, usually it's JSON, but I have seen in the past it being in XML. So it just depends on the system. What's nice is that it is very generalizable. So it means that they can pass down a lot of different amount of information. The bad part about this is that you might have to adjust how you program for the API, what's it called, response. So like if you get different responses, you're gonna have to modify your code to make sure what kind of response you'll get and like how to process that information. Just like we saw with JSON yesterday, is that sometimes it can be processed or be sent in different ways and stuff like that. And you have to be aware of what that information is going to come back as. But this is kind of nice because it allows you, like the way I kind of see this is like, usually we say like SQL servers are kind of like in my opinion, I guess, okay, this is where I'm going to like go a little back and forth. But I'd say like the easiest one is like it's already on your computer, like a CSV file. It's like, all right, it's already ordered. You know it's on your computer, CSV file. Your next one might be like on down that tier of like idealness is like a SQL server. So a SQL server is nicest because it does have a lot of information, but you can basically use SQL, right? Command code essentially, right? And say, get me these specific things and have the server do the work and then get that information and then process it through. The next part would be an API where that's almost raw data, where it's kind of like, it's not necessarily, it's structured, but it's not maybe structured in the way that you would hope for, like compared to like a SQL request or a CSV. So it might not be already in a nice format in a way. And also you have to worry about how much information you can get through, how much it will allow you to get. Is it going to take a long time, or whatever it is that you have the API. The last part, which we'll talk about next week, is web scraping. Excuse me. And web scraping, basically, it's kind of like, we talk about being dirty data, scraping, scrubbing. You can hear all these great terms that we use as data scientists to describe web scraping. And essentially, it's basically trying to pull the information off of some website, right? And it's kind of in the worst form because we have to figure out how to take a website's information and put it into a nice form, like a data frame or whatever object we want to actually use it in. Okay. And then I guess at the very bottom of the barrel, I would say like surveys, like, actually going out and like asking people. But I'll straight up tell you is that you probably will never have to deal with that as a data scientist because it's not worth your time. You can't get enough data quickly enough and cheaply enough. So usually those are going to be the most stuff, web scraping above. Okay. So these other API types, so that's kind of me going on a tangent, but like we have the web database, which is nice, kind of like similar to think of like how you would use a SQL server, right? But it's going to be probably JSON format, maybe some funky stuff. The next two parts are operating systems and hardware, which I'm going to just quickly kind of talk about. I'm not even going to show examples. Is operating systems, you can actually say, when I basically do this, when I move my mouse around, it should do this thing. When I type in ls, it should show me this information. So APIs can actually communicate amongst an operating system, basically how the computer functions. And then one step deeper is your hardware. So if you ever think about this, which is kind of weird when you think about it, and you press like a button on your keyboard, right? It knows what to do on the screen. Like how did it know to do that, right? So there's an API that actually says from the hardware that says, all right, when this certain kind of electrical signal comes in, you should do this thing. And then that carries all the way up to the operating system. So you might actually have multiple APIs talking to each other from at once. These are generally, like they're technically APIs. They're usually not what we're talking about when we say an API. Usually we're talking about a web interface or database. You might also hear things like, you'll hear things like the Keras API. And you'll be like, it's like, oh, this package API, or like you might even hear some refer to as the Pandas API or the Python API. And what that's really saying is like another way to do something in that form. So like you're using a way, you're writing software, you're writing code essentially to do something for that package to do. So for example, technically Python is running on top of C. So in some ways you can kind of think of, and this is probably not the exact way of phrasing this, but you know, whatever, is that you can think of like Python is talking to the C code underneath. It's like an API talking, saying, all right, write this stuff and now do these things. It's a little more complicated than that, so it's not the best example, but you can kind of think of when you hear like a code API, like the Java API, essentially you're writing code that will do something in Java essentially. So you might hear that phrase as well. And that's closer to like this part right here, this operating systems. Okay. So any questions on these API types? Pretty straightforward, right? And main ones, as I said, web and database is what we'll probably really care about and talk about. All right. So I keep talking about this client and server. So I might as well talk about the client server model itself. Excuse me. You can think of it like a distributed architecture where basically you have a client and a server. Now, technically, your client and server can actually be on the same machine, just like I talked about like operating system and hardware. So like your server could be like some hardware that basically say, oh, do this with hardware, like blink a light or something like that. But the point is basically they're two separate entities. One's sending the request, one's receiving the request, and one's also sending out the response, which again goes back to the client. So usually servers, when we talk about this though, in the case like database and web services, basically they're providing a service, right? That's why they're serving us, right? So servers usually can do some extra stuff. So usually it's separate like from the client. Like I said, like it's somewhere else on the network. Whenever you go to a website, you are basically going to a server, and the server is feeding back information to you on the web page. Your client, which is basically like the thing they're using to control. So for us, would be kind of like your own computer. You can think of it like whenever you type stuff in the Jupyter Notebook, that is the client. It's requesting a service. So it's requesting saying, hey, can you do this for me? And note that this tends to be software, right? This is like I said, writing the code. It can be hardware, like I said, like if I push a button, it could technically be part of the API as a client, but generally we'll talk about it as a software itself, okay? So some details on client and server. Client, for the web example, you can say like, let's see here, how do I want to phrase this? When you are going on a web browser, essentially like your web browser is the client, right? So like your web browser is the client. It says, all right, we go to facebook.com, and basically the browser is saying, all right, Facebook, like it basically asks the server, which is located for facebook.com, and says, hey, give me the first page of facebook.com. And then the server gives you back information, actually gives you an HTML file, and basically says, all right, here it is. The thing is the browser actually is showing this for us. It's like, hey, this is what the file we got back. This is also true, like if you ask for Google, for example, if you put in google.com, you start typing in, you know, like you type in my name, Victor Geislinger, right? Basically, you put Victor Geislinger, enter, right? Basically, it's sending an API call and saying, hey, what Google server, go ahead and give me information, what you should display, what I should display for Victor Geislinger. and then it gives you back that information. Now, you might say this seems a little simplistic because especially nowadays you can start typing and it starts autofilling. There's some tricks and stuff like that it does to do that, but essentially it's the same idea. So that's what that web server is basically you're defining, you're saying, hey, here's this information and it's giving it back. And then the client says, all right, I got this bunch of gobbledygook, HTML stuff that no one wants to read. And so it actually takes that information and does something with it. In this case, it makes a nice, beautiful web page so that you can actually read it as a human being. So just to kind of prove this point, if I, for example, go to google.com, and we'll show HTML next. So you can see this nice little pretty part, right? But if I do inspect right here, you actually see there's, well, this is weird. I don't know why it's doing it that way. Oh, because I had it on the other side. Okay, that's weird. But you can see this guy right here. This right here is actually HTML. This is actually a file. So if you actually do like, command save, for example, you can actually see here is that I can actually save this file as an HTML file. And that is Google. So if I actually do this and I open up the file now, you can actually say, it looks like Google, right? And that's because it essentially, when I put in google.com, what I did basically, oops, how do I get rid of you? Command I? Nope. Oh, there it is. Cool. When I actually put in google.com, it said basically Google server says, here's the web page. And then my browser actually does something with it. In this case, it displays it. So that's essentially how you can think of your client. Your client's going to get information back and do something with it to go from there. Okay. So any questions on that? Hopefully that was not too confusing. Okay. So next part, like I said, the server for the web example, basically it's listening to saying, what are you asking for? So when I put google.com, it's listening for this part right here. We call that HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Basically, it's just saying that hypertext is just the type of document, transfer, meaning I'm sending it over, and protocol is just the way it transfers it, the way it's sending it. So basically it's requesting it. So if I go to, for example, google.com, if I go to, let's say I go to Facebook and I log into my user account and authenticates, is this the actual user? Can you do this? It looks at the request, performs actions and processes anything that it needs. So it says, oh, I need to do some extra work, and then sends a response back. So that response can just be the web page itself. Okay. Let's see here, client server model. I don't want to have in our database. Okay, same idea. So can be called from the server to get the data from the client. So the web and the database can be relatively similar. It's just most of the time when we talk about web, there's a very specific output that it will have. Okay, cool. Any questions on this? Cool. All right. So HTTP requests. So I kind of mentioned, if you ever noticed, you can't see it here. Actually, I think Chrome actually got rid of it. Oh, there it is. Okay, good. So you can see HTTP, HTTPS. This is basically saying what kind of transfer protocol it's using. So when we say HTTP request, essentially what we're saying is hey, give me a web page back. And essentially that's what we're asking the server. So you can actually do this in Python to actually get a specific HTML. So you say, hey, go to google.com and give me the web page. And we can use, I think there's one too many L's in here. No, that's right. No, wait. No, I'm confused. Anyway, URL lib and URL lib2.
It's two L's.
Yeah, I don't know why I have 3 in here. We'll just pretend that didn't happen. Okay, cool. I must have copied and pasted it or something and it was wrong. But it should be your URL lib. So I think I have a code example here as well. Oh, no, I have requests. So note that these libraries, oh, someone say something? No? Okay. These libraries can be used to grab HTTP requests. However, they can be kind of complicated. So you'll see me use requests a little bit easier. Note that you'll see references to URL lib2. I just don't like to use them as much because they're just a little more complicated and kind of have some weirdness to it sometimes. So one example we can do is actually use requests, which we'll use, I think, pretty much throughout the whole curriculum, as well as any examples I'll show here. But it's just a library already built into Python. And you can see here, I'm actually can take the request of https google.com, which should be this guy, except me signed out, right? So I can say, all right, go ahead and get me google.com. So basically it's like the same thing as my browser going here and I get a response back. That's our RESP. So I can actually, from this response, if I'm just going to print this out, you'll see it's a big information. Oh, you can't see any of that part. Sorry, it's an object, so that's why you can't. If I do this part, it returns back an object. So you see, That's what this is. So anyway, I get a response, and basically from that response, I can get things like status code saying, you know, are you up? Did you 404? If you guys ever see 404 pages, it means that that page does not exist or you don't have access to it. 200 usually means success. So you can see here if I do response.status code, it should give me 200 since I saw that worked out fine. And you can see here, I can actually check it with code's okay, meaning that it was like success. And you can see 200, oh, it was okay. So it's like, all right, cool. That means I get a response back. So if you were coding this out to do it automated, you might have, was the response code okay? You know, was it a 200 code? Was it a 404 code? And then if it was, you would proceed forward. Okay, so from this part, I already have that response. I can actually see the full text. So that full text is that Google response, basically. And you can see, even though as simple as Google looks, it definitely has a lot more to it than just that. But you can see here's an HTML file. So it's giving me a bunch of information. Essentially, this is the same exact thing that the web browser would be getting if I did google.com on the web browser. It would be getting this file and then displaying it for us. So once I have this file, then I can actually do things like I can see headers, for example. In this case, I believe it's just saying what I sent over. So like this is also giving me information of the response of like, you know, when was it sent back to me? You can see there's some cache control. So this is, let's do display. That might be a little bit easier for us to see. Nope. Okay. Never mind then. Oh, because it's a string. So that's part of the reason why probably. But you can see here, basically, it's a dictionary. And note that when we say dictionary, it also means that it's a JSON object, right? So that's why this is being sent over. And you can see some extra stuff like set the cookie and stuff like that. So when I visit the website, it sets the cookie to say, okay, this is your special cookie that is for you and you only kind of deal. So anyway, that's our information. You can see, for example, from these headers, I can get the specific date and server. So we should get this date. We should get whatever server it was. And we can see it was sent over this time. And then GWS is Google Web Services. So basically, it's like think of AWS, Amazon Web Services. This is Google Web Services. So they have their own servers, essentially. But you might have something different. So note that this isn't necessarily the same every single time. This might be different depending on who you asked, who you got the request from. So, for example, I might pull something up and says, oh, that thing doesn't exist yet because it didn't pass me that information. So you have to kind of double check and see what keys are available. Okay. So that's kind of like a very basic website and like sense like what I'm getting from it. But the point is that you can get information. Okay, cool. All right. So next part is actually passing parameters. So this is kind of a fun website. So this httpin.org, you can use this to practice out your, I think this leads you to an actual website. This actually lets you practice out different, you know, ways to do requests. So there's a whole bunch of things you can do. Like for example, just asking for information or posting information or whatnot. So it's a kind of fun website to do. But we can actually show this in here. So you can see here my credentials. I basically wrote it as a, and this is just random. This is not going to work for anything, right? But you can see here, username Luigi, password I love peach, right? And so this is my JSON object right here. Note that it is a dictionary right here, but I can just send that parameters as a dictionary. I don't have to convert it to JSON. I don't have to do anything funky. I can just simply put this through request.get. So what this is basically going to this specific website. And if I go to this website, I don't think I'll actually be able to see anything. Let's see. It won't give me anything right here. Oops, you can't see that. So if I just go to get right here with no parameters, this is what it'll send me back. So this is just an example website. So it's not like a real fun. You can see it's in JSON format, but you can see args is arguments. So I didn't pass in any arguments. And you can see some headings right here. For example, you can see accept, DNT, host, right? Note that no server is here in this case. And then you can see origin. Basically, that should be where I come from. And then URL is the actual URL that I sent in. So we'll see now if I actually pass in these parameters, username and Luigi, we can do this and we can actually see now the response, which is, or sorry, R is the actual response. And then note that I changed the response, which was JSON, right? I changed that over into Python so I can actually do stuff with it. So with these results, I can see origin, for example. I'm just, oh well. You get some of my IP address anyway, so oh well. But anyway, that was just to hide it. But you can see r.url, that's the actual response I got back. That's what the URL was. But I can also just give the results, and you can see here, I think the display will be better here now. There we go. So you can see here, is that this is giving back now args, password, and username Luigi, along with headers, like I said before. Origin, I changed that to none, but here's the actual URL. So if I actually go to this URL, this would give me the same exact information in JSON form. Okay, but essentially that's how you can use requests to send out parameters to a specific, URL. Okay, and next question people ask is like, how do you know what to do? You have to look it up. You have to see what this website actually receives and stuff like that. You can try playing things around and see if you can figure it out. But if you're actually trying to do useful work, you probably would try to look at this documentation page and figure out what to do from there. Okay, cool. And then last one is HTTP post, which is talked about in the curriculum. Basically, this is a way, for example, like if you wanted to upload something, so posts could be used a lot for like images. In this case, this is fake. This is not really, didn't do anything, but you can see here, if I do this right here, this uploads the image to this website right here. And this is just basically, note that this is super long information. These are basically a bunch of, like think of zeros and ones, essentially. That's what this is representing, saying that this is the actual image of like different pixels and stuff like that. So just know that it just gave a response back to that. And you can see here, here's all my headers again. Okay, cool. All right, any questions on any of these kind of like coding parts? Thumbs up, thumbs down, sideways for understanding. Yeah. There's like I see a lot of like I want to point up, but I really shouldn't, and that's perfectly fine. I think honestly a lot of this stuff, it makes more sense as you try it out and see what works out. Honestly, I think you seeing me do it doesn't make as much sense as compared to you actually trying it out. Okay, but anyway, that's how you would write the code. And note that most of this stuff is actually directly from the curriculum, so you can kind of go off of that. All right, so an important aspect I'll talk about before we'll show a little example is OAuth, so open authorization. So know that there's a difference between authorization and authentication. So authorizing basically is saying, are you allowed to do stuff? Authentication is basically saying, are you authentic? Are you actually the person you say you are? So note that those are not necessarily equal to each other. So one thing you might not want to do every time you ask for an API is ask for someone's password every single time. That would be a real pain and stuff like that. And plus, that's more like saying like, hey, are they authenticated in the sense that they are who they say they are, but you just want to see if they're authorized in this way. So usually authorization has a kind of a nice quick way to do this. Is basically you can get credentials from a website by logging into the website first and then asking for, what's it called? A certain key essentially. And what that key does is it authorizes you to allow you to do things with it. Or sometimes an authorization can pop up on your computer and you basically say, yes, I allow this to happen. So the reason why we do this is because we want to separate authentication and authorization. So authentication means that we could say exactly who you are, but that might not be the best thing to kind of float back and forth every single time for security reasons and just practical reasons. Really what you want to be able to say is like, well, okay, I don't really care who this person is. I just want to know, are they authorized to do this kind of thing? And this can even be true for, what's it called? Like things that aren't sensitive. Like if you just want to see, if you go on twitter.com, you can see whatever you want, right? You don't have to log into the website. So you might want to just authorize in the sense that, are you allowed to look at this? The real reason why we do authorization is, one, so you know who the person is, so you know what things they're allowed to look at. But the second part is that you don't accidentally spam the website and stuff like this, or purposely spam the website. So note that, what's it called? Like you can technically keep asking the website like, hey, what's my name? Hey, or like say, hey, what time is it? 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 You could do this a bunch of times, and that can clog up how much the server can answer. This is like, if you guys ever heard of denial of service attack or DDoS attack, that's essentially what that is. Essentially, it's basically, well, usually it's multiple people because computers are pretty sophisticated now. But essentially what you do, you keep asking, saying, hey, what time is it? Or, other stupid questions or whatever, or give me information. But you do this very, very quickly. Basically, the server can't answer all the questions at once and it gets stuck. So basically they want to avoid that kind of issue. So they do things called like rate limiting. They do things like basically like you can only have so many times you can ask within a minute or within an hour. how much data you can get within this minute or hour. That way they can restrict the number of people who can actually like ask for certain things. That way it protects you from, like, let's say if you run a while loop and you just keep saying in that while loop, you know, ask what time it is, but you forgot to put it into like, let's go, like you did like while like true and just went on forever and ever and ever and ever. Well, then it's like, oh, and you forgot it and you just let it go. Well, the problem is the website's going to keep getting those requests over and over and over and over and over and over again. This way they can identify saying, who is it? Let's go ahead and ban this person for right now, or rate limit them so they don't keep asking questions and bogging out our system. That's the real reason why we would do these kind of things. Okay. But I won't go through the whole process of this because every website's a little bit different. But for the most part, you go to a website and you say, the OAuth anyway. Basically, you go to a website and you usually have to log in at least once. It'll say, okay, like, do you allow this to happen? It goes, all right, sounds good. And then it authenticates either on your computer or it authenticates in the sense that it gives you a password or an API token, key and secret kind of deal. So that can be useful as well. Yeah, anyway, that's kind of like a quick thing of like security stuff. But yeah, that's kind of all the APIs. I know it's kind of, I went through relatively quickly. There's more we can kind of go into and stuff like that. But I think it's best to use the curriculums, like practice in the labs and stuff like that. I think that'll help you see different ways of using APIs and everything and get a little more detail of like how to use them. Yeah, but any questions at this point? Okay, cool. All right. So then I have one last thing here. We have an example using an API. So I think it's going to be easiest for me if I go ahead and pull up this Google Colab page. And let's see here. Have you guys used Google Colab yet? I can't remember if I've shared this with you. Oh, no. Okay, so what's kind of cool is that Google Colab is, it's from Google. It's kind of like a Google Drive or a Google Doc, but it's also combined in the sense that, what's it called? You can run Jupyter, like you can run code like a Jupyter notebook. So that's kind of nice, is that you guys can also have access to this. So let me, all right, I have my lamp over here, so let me go and move my lamp. There we go. So you guys can see that lamp's on, right? You can kind of see it in the background. Okay, so that is a smart light right there. So what's kind of cool is that you can actually use an API to actually control this smart light. So I'll show you guys briefly, and then I'll give you guys control. So I'm going to go ahead and just import request in JSON. Okay, so this is basically importing those specific libraries. And then, no, this is just like a Jupyter notebook. And then this token right here, it's like, where did this token come from? I had to go to my LIFX, LIFX, that's who makes the bulbs here. Asking for the API, it generates a random token. You can see it's super long, so you can't just simply guess it. And don't worry, I'm going to disable this afterwards so you can't control my lights after the fact or whatever. But I generate this token right here, and basically I'm authorized now to use this. And now I can actually run this right here, and you can see the responses. So let's see here. This will go through. So that basically just went to LIFX and said, hey, here's Victor's token. Is he authorized to go to do this, right? And basically said, all right, this response. So we can actually see now what this response looks like. So now if I go and show this, and this is based off of the LIFX, and I'll show you what the LIFX documentation looks like. But now this basically represents all these different parts. So you can see it's going to be a list of lights. So I think I'm trying to scroll through this a little bit. So you can see here is that each one of these parts is actually represented by a light. So I have, I think, a total of 4 lights that are connected right now. So you can see here the brightness, the color, is it connected, true, effect. So you can do things like, you know, have it flicker and change colors. Power's off, so that's the first light's off. Let's see if we can find this light. Brightness is 0.04. I think this is the light right here. And is it connected? Power on? Yeah. Okay, so this is my light right here. So that's this set of, from the light, this part of the JSON is representing that light right there. So note that I moved out of the bedroom, right? So it's called bedroom light 2. You can see the information, when it was last seen, location, which is a given ID. So like, you know, if I have a specific place where I have it. Note Kelvin, someone asked before, like, you can control the like temperature of this, and like, oh, it's just the color to Kelvin. So like if you ever look at like LED bulbs, you can change, like, you know, is it a white light or more of a yellow light? Someone thought that you could actually control the, what's it called, like the temperature. Note that this light also has infrared, so I can actually turn on and off the infrared as well. So this is useful like for like, you know, security cameras and stuff like that. So anyway, some fun stuff. So anyway, this is kind of like the response back and like, okay, cool. So now what I can do, I can say, all right, let's go ahead and just see what the labels are. And this case, I believe it's bedroom light 2, which is that one over there. So we're going to try to change that around. And now I can actually do some things like power on, power off. So I'm actually going to go ahead and turn this off. And note that I use the selector. So this way I don't have to actually copy and paste anything. I just get the lights that I got response earlier. I know it's the second one, or I guess I think this actually should be the third one. Or I'm sorry, not the second one, the number 1. Because I think I changed it up. So this should be actually lights 1. I can get the ID and see if I can turn it power off. Okay, and so if this is right, we should see that thing turn off. Let's see your results. What do we have? Oh, that's offline. So maybe it was lights 2. I wasn't paying attention. If you guys know which one it was, I can turn it off. Power off. Nope. Oh, label, that's the wrong one. Let's see here. Yeah, you know what? We can try all of them. So let's try 0. And power off results. This is probably helps if I just do display. This is where I should have tested it beforehand, but I got caught up with front light. Nope. Okay. Well, let's see. We had 0, we did 1, we did 2. Let's try 3. Ah, there it goes. Okay. So it's number 3. So what was 3? 3 was, oops. What's the label here? Bedroom light 1. So it's bedroom light number 1. So you can see here, the quick way I could have done this, I could have like done a for loop and gone through all the lights, but I just going to keep going through. So note that I didn't have to copy the actual ID, which in this case is the very last one, which is this one, I believe. I could have copied the ID, which is this guy, but you can see I could have just simply referred to it from the previous response. So now what I can do certain things. Let's turn it back on. So I can do this call right here and it should turn it back on. Beautiful, right? And now I can do things like, I'm gonna have to change this back to 3 now. I can do certain things like, I believe I can change different states. I think that's what this was supposed to do. This was turn it on and off or change the color. So you can see it changed to red. You can do like random stuff, right? You can also change it like certain hex codes and stuff like that as well. So this is really fun with like Halloween and stuff. I put on like my front lawn, we will change stuff. And you can see here, we can turn lights off and everything. So what's cool is that just to prove that it's not just me like having some like flip in the back, I'm sending you all the link to this. So if you open this up, I believe it changes however you want. Everything should be set. Just to confirm, just look at that first page and it should have the same API token here and be able to change this part up. So if anyone wants to try to turn that light off for me, and you guys can all try. I don't know what happens if you get too many requests at once, but you guys are welcome to try. Note that if it doesn't change, because I didn't save it over, this should be 3, not 2. So yeah, we'll see if someone can get that turned off first. A race to see who can do it first.
Are those just lights?
Go ahead.
Are those hue lights?
They're actually LIFX, LIFX. So there, someone turned it off. So all right, Jenny for the win. Okay, so while you guys kind of play around with this, I can talk a little bit about these lights. So one reason why I use LIFX lights in general, they're an Australian company. They're really great. They're very open with like what they share. They also, for my sake, is I like to tweak things around with like my smart home stuff. I don't have to be connected to the internet to actually do this. I can actually do a local API, which most smart lights and most smart home stuff don't let you do. This is much more, oh cool, someone's changing around. But they're a little, to be honest, they're a little more expensive than probably like a typical smart light because you can get them pretty cheap now. But I like the fact that I have the full API. So if the company ever goes under or they decide we're not going to support this anymore, I can have full control over it with my home server, which I kind of mess around with and stuff. But anyway, I'll show you guys the actual web page and stuff. So this right here, and if anyone wants to, let's see here. If anyone wants to go to this website or whatever and mess around and see what other things you can do some fun stuff like breathing effects and things. But this would be like a similar idea of like what you can do. You can see how they talk about authentication. I know that they actually show some Python code, which is really nice. You can simply copy and paste this and essentially put these different parts in here. Not every place does it. You can also see there's rate limits. So you can see basically seeing how many times like you can ask the on the API saying, how many times can I ask for things over a certain period of time? So if you ask for like 500, requests within 60 seconds, it might not let you do that. You can also see different parts. For example, you can set like power or let's say breathe effect. So you can see here is that it shows in Python what this would look like. So you can actually have more of a breathing effect going through certain cycles and such like that. So there's ways you can kind of like mess around with this and just do different things and whatnot. I think there's also, in this case, okay, I still have time. You can do things like actually turning on and off the infrared too. So if you had an infrared camera as well on this, you can actually turn the infrared on and off depending on what it is. So anyway, that's kind of like how you can do stuff. And note that this API shows posts, which means like you can think of it like you're changing something. You can also do things like get, like you can get a list of the lights like we did before. So you can see when we did that first part right here, where is it? Oh, this light right here. I'm basically doing a get request as well and saying, just show me all the lights and all the information about them. Okay, so you can see that that's what that came from. And then from there, you can do whatever you want. So I thought that was kind of a fun thing for you guys to be able to mess around with. Bless you. Cool. Any questions on this or kind of messing around or anything like that? No? Okay, cool.
Can you do that to my lights next week?
Yeah, that'd be fun, right? We'll change. I've been tempted in the sense like after doing this like lesson, just keeping this lamp in the background and to see if people like would just randomly change it or whatnot. But I revoked the the API token after a certain amount of time because I don't want that just floating around. But yeah, there's some really cool stuff you can do. Like this is like again, is this exactly what you'll do as a data scientist like this through API? No, but it gives you an idea of what you're doing, and it gives, I don't know, I think giving a physical thing is kind of a fun thing because we can see data all the time. But there you go, you can see people who actually run it and stuff like that. But this is what's cool about Colab. Colab used to have a feature where you can see live coding at the same time, but unfortunately they discontinued that feature like earlier this year, which was a bummer because it was a pretty nice thing to be able to do. But what was I going to say? Oh, the API practice that's in the, what's it called, in the curriculum. I would strongly suggest going through it. There's the Yelp API. I can't remember what the other API one that they have in there. But a lot of that's going to be going through specific documentation. But the concept's the same, is that you're basically sending a request. That's what this header is basically. It's giving information. So you can see here parameters, like payload. In this case, I call it payload. And you can see this data basically is going to give this information as a JSON, essentially, and then whatever you want, getting that part back. And you can see here, in this case, you can see the different, it's just sending it back as another JSON part, and you can pull that in and do stuff with it. Okay. All right, everyone. Well, yeah. Any questions then on anything we talked about today? APIs? Anything else? Okay, cool. For the record, if you ever want to get like these LIFX bulbs, I might have a code for you, like discount code. Not that like I'm getting kickback or anything like that, but I just think they're really cool bulbs and I'd like to support their company. Anyway, I've had them for a long time and they also are like super bright compared to like Hue bulbs, which are like 800 lumens. These are, I think they start off at 1100, which is nice because like, oh good, it's a little bit brighter so you can actually use them in like a living room setting and stuff like that. But they are not super cheap. So, but I'm okay with it, supporting that company. And they also are pretty good with their security and privacy. And they give me the ability to make my own server. So I don't have to rely on them if I don't want to. All right, everyone. Well, with that then, I guess I'll go ahead and stop it here. I'm going to stop recording.